warm welcome if you're joining from home as well. And I'm going to continue on the series this evening with some of another one of Sangharakshita's talks, Bhante Sangharakshita's talk, the man who founded Triratna. And a classic, all of these talks actually were sort of seminal in a sense. They have had a very, very strong effect on the movement down through the years. And actually what we teach here at the London Buddhist Centre will all be informed from them in one way or another, as a broad sort of corpus of work. They'll be informed by them. But the talk that I'm going to be talking about this evening was a talk called The Taste of Freedom, and it was given very early on in the movement, actually 1970 I think, or something like that, and not far from here, I think in York Hall maybe, or somewhere similar. And it's actually, when I sort of thought I'd give it, I thought, oh, fantastic, it's a great talk. It is a great talk, but it's not particularly unified. Actually, Sangharakshita, when he was talking in the early days, would give very, very broad, because he was still introducing Buddhism to a new audience, and so would give very, very broad talks, quite wide-ranging talks. So I'm going to use the talk. You won't, if you go back, I'd really encourage you all to go back and listen or read the talk. It's a fantastic talk, but you'll find I just take a bit of it and sort of riff off that this evening. So the setting when Sangharakshita talks about the Taste of Freedom. So the Taste of Freedom talk itself is referring to an udana, and an udana was one of the early teachings of the Buddha. And you'll notice the udanas, you can actually get a book of udana. It might even be of the udanas. They're in the library, and they're often marked by being quite poetic. In latter years, say for example, if you open up the Pali Canon, which is the sort of, you could say, edited and sort of collected and transcribed teachings of the Buddha, as has been collected by the monks down through the years, you'll find it's quite sort of the 7 of this and the 6 of that and the 4 of this. It's very, very neat, and it's all very worked out. And actually the first teaching that the Buddha was said to have given upon the dawn of his enlightenment, which was the the name has escaped me, but you'll notice almost like a complete presentation of the teachings. Now, scholars know now that that's not the first teaching the Buddha would have given. It just couldn't have been, because that sort of whole neat presentation was developed as the Buddha taught down through the years. Actually, the early teachings from the Buddha in this collection of the udanas are very sort of, they're very poetic. They tend to be quite sort of symbolical. There's aspects of them that are dropped in latter years. So, he'll use language that he drops in latter years because it doesn't quite work as a sort of teaching method. It's very sort of experimental. And you immediately sort of get a sense of somebody that's working it out as he goes. He's had this incredible sort of vision, and he's trying to figure out how to communicate it, and sometimes it's working and sometimes it's not working. The early teachings are quite different from the later teachings in that sort of way. Sort of things are still being they're still a bit messy, and I quite like them for that reason. Actually, they're a bit sort of they're not as neat. So these udanas, an udana is said to be, I think literally the word is an out-breath. So udana means out-breath, and I suppose what that's suggesting, in fact, what it means, is it's something like a spontaneous uttering. So it's a sort of spontaneous teaching that comes to the Buddha. And this particular udana that Sangharakshita was talking about in this talk was exactly that sort of thing. It's set in the middle of the night in medieval India, and it's completely pitch black, but there was a full moon according to the udana, and this sort of vast collection of the Buddha's followers, the monks were just gathered all the way around the forest, and it would have been completely still. You wouldn't have been able to hear anything. In fact, quite often during the night, the Buddha and the Buddha's followers, the monastic followers, just sat on all through the night, not saying a word, often very, very late into the night, just kind of maybe not even meditating, maybe just sort of being sat together, just being happy to sort of sit together. A total sort of sense of kind of ease and comfort and relaxation, sense of affection, maybe a bit like Cash Mitra was talking about in the first half, affection for each other, sort of just enjoying the presence of each other and just sitting sort of quietly. This is regularly what the Buddha and his followers would do. And suddenly the Buddha comes out with this teaching. So again, you get this spontaneous exclamation. And these weren't, you couldn't force them. We know that, don't we? Sometimes something just comes to mind. It's like you have to be very, very patient with it. And sometimes a sort of gust of inspiration will just come to mind, and you'll just give a teaching. So the Buddha, in these nightly sits and these nighttime sits, could just sort of spontaneously give rise to a teaching. And in this particular teaching, he says that the Dharma, so the Buddha's teaching, is like a great ocean. The Dharma is like a great ocean. He says it has 8 characteristics, just like the great ocean. Now, it's interesting that the Buddha never would have seen the ocean in his lifetime. He grew up in an area which is now Nepal, became enlightened in Bodh Gaya, which is now in Bihar, and it's quite a bit into sort of central India. Like the ocean is thousands of miles away, I presume. And the Buddha did walk quite a vast area in his time, but he never would have seen the ocean. But of course, he would have heard about the ocean. Stories of the ocean would have come to him. Quite something. You do sometimes hear of this, actually. So I remember watching, I think it was Oprah or something, when I was a teenager. And Oprah, she's just, there's a car for everybody, didn't she? If I was Oprah, I'd go, there's a car for everybody. And everyone, way, fantastic, a car. But so she used to do these sort of very kind of spontaneous, generous things. And this particular sort of show, they took somebody who had never seen the ocean in the US. There's loads of people in the US who have never seen the ocean. They're in sort of the mid states, and they've never seen the ocean. There's so much poverty in America that so many people could never possibly afford to get to either of the coasts to see the ocean. So there's still many, many people today who would have never seen the ocean before. You can imagine just what a remarkable thing it must be to even imagine the ocean. Most people have probably seen a large body of water, like a lake or something like that, or even a river, whatever it might have been. But you can imagine thinking of the ocean. So the ocean would have had a very sort of mythical, kind of poetic feel to the Buddha's followers. Presumably most of them would have never seen the ocean as well. And the Buddha says that the ocean has these 8 characteristics. So I'll say a little bit about them. The talk really is actually about the 8th, but in fact the 6th as it goes, but what I'll present is the 8th. But I'll say a little bit about the others actually, because it'd be good to sort of go through them. So the Buddha says that the ocean gets gradually deeper. So it's a graduated sort of deepening into the ocean. And he says the Dharma is like that as well. So there's no sudden precipice with the ocean. So it's a bit like the teachings of Buddhism. You don't sort of suddenly just fall into a very deep understanding of the Dharma. It's gradual, it's regular steps, it's ongoing steps. So much of what we do now, if you say, for example, look at the literature on self-development or whatever it might be, it's hacks, isn't it? That's the sort of the current thing that we're looking for. If you go onto YouTube and it's 10 hacks to find love, or 5 things you have to do if you want a 6-figure salary or something like that. It's all, and it's boom, 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 boom. You could do them all tomorrow if you wanted. These are sort of life hacks. Well, there's no hacks in Buddhism. There's no sort of instantaneous resolutions There's no instantaneous penetrations of the way things are, or of the Buddha's teachings in that particular way. You have to work gradually and steadily at it. Now, that doesn't mean actually that it's not a fairly steep gradient, because my experience of the Buddha's teachings actually is that they can lead to very, very quick changes when they're taken on in this steady, consistent way. I was talking to somebody recently. Actually, they were talking in a group, and they'd been practicing Buddhism for a long time. And they said they were looking back at their time practicing Buddhism, and they said, and you make these infinitesimal, tiny little steps, and you don't even know you're making changes, and you look back and you've changed, and sometimes it seems like you've not changed at all. I just wanted to say, I don't agree. I just wanted to say, I don't know what your experience of this is, because it's not my experience of it. My experience of it actually is that if you give yourself over to these teachings, you can make revolutionary changes very, very quickly. If you do the metta bhavana, for example, like we did earlier in the first half, you can make revolutionary changes to your mind in quite a short space of time. Now, we're probably still talking years. It's not week, you know. We are talking years. But I promise you probably won't find it elsewhere. Yeah, these are radical changes that you will do with your mind. It does take work, but they're radical changes. So the Buddha says it gradually gets deeper, and he says it's stable in nature, so it doesn't step over its boundaries. The ocean doesn't step over its boundaries. Now, of course, because it's a myth for the Buddha, we can't take it literally. So you can't go, don't talk to me about melting icebergs, yeah? Because obviously the sea is going to behave slightly differently. The ocean behaves slightly differently from what the Buddha is saying here. But the Buddha says it has set boundaries. It has a defined boundary. And likewise, the Buddha's followers don't overstep those boundaries. They stay within those boundaries. They follow the system of training. And hopefully that's true as well. Yeah? So even say, for example, we know, I think most people who come to the centre know that people who have been practicing Buddhism for a long, long time, they're not angels. Order members are not angels. We can misbehave. We can be grumpy, we can be cravey, we can be anxious. So it's not like there is angelicism as soon as one starts to practice Buddhism. That's simply not the case. But hopefully one who follows the Dharma, and particularly somebody who's committed their life to doing that, and that's what being ordained into the Triratna Buddhist system means. You get this very, very strong sense of conscious, almost like an alarm bell that starts to go off when you're tempted to behave unethically. It's like just something just sort of rings, and you can't do it in the same way that you used to be able to do it before. You just can't do it anymore in a way that you might have found quite easily to be unethical, and prior to coming across Buddhism, you just can't do it. Maybe some of you have experienced that as well. So the Great Ocean, the next characteristic of it is that it rejects a dead body. So if, say, for example, somebody drowns in the sea, or a dead body is thrown into the sea, a dead body comes back up, doesn't it? So it rejects a dead body. And what the metaphor here is that you can't have a nominal membership of a Buddhist community. You can't be a sort of card carrier, for example, and that make you a Buddhist. To be a Buddhist, you have to practice Buddhism. I was brought up in a Catholic setting. You got christened, and then you were a Catholic. In Buddhism, you can't be born into Buddhism. It's really that would have been very, very far. In certain Buddhist countries now, probably people would say, I don't know actually, maybe people would say you could, where it's become sort of more of a social religion in that sort of sense. But that would have been very, very alien to the Buddha in his time. He wouldn't have thought of Buddhists in that particular way. In fact, Buddhist wasn't a term that would have been used. But somebody who followed the Buddha Dharma you couldn't be sort of born into it. You couldn't be a nominal member of that body of people. You actually had to practice Buddhism to be a Buddhist. So it rejects a dead body. And it says that the next characteristic of Buddhism, or that the rivers converge, of the great ocean, is that the rivers converge when they reach it. So this is the next characteristic of the ocean, that the rivers converge when they meet it. So the rivers lose their identity, their sort of separate, say, group identity. When they reach the great ocean, they become one with the great ocean. And what the Buddha was talking about here was particularly the caste system. Very, very strong in the Buddha's day, and still reasonably strong in India today, but quite strong in the Buddha's day. Would have been a gradation of those according to caste. Hindu teaching the idea that you are born into a particular group of people, and that caste establishes your life journey from then on. So the job that you do, the friends that you keep, the person that you marry, all of those. In its strict sense, the caste system, that's what it represents. A very, very strong segregation of people according to the families that they were born into and the caste that they were born into. Now, the Buddha completely rejected that. He said that when you come from the world, when you leave the world and you join the Buddha's followers, you leave behind your caste identity. You leave behind your group identity. You just become a Buddhist. So significantly here, in the West, we have our own versions that sort of correspond in a certain way, maybe not always as strong, but correspond to caste. Class is very strong, isn't it? People's accent tends to sort of slightly shape and push them into a certain life path, and often people find it hard to mix across accents, both up and down actually. It's not just something that's imposed on lower classes, or it goes both ways. There's a segregation, a social segregation that goes with caste. Race plays a role, nationality plays a role, all of those things. So when you join the Sangha, the Buddha's community, what the Buddha is saying with this is that you actually leave those group identities behind. You no longer, in any significant sort of sense, have a caste, have a sort of identify according to a race, or identify very strongly according to a nationality. All of those things will of course be part of you still, but you drop that strong identification with them, and you relate to people who are in that community of the Buddhist followers, not as Irish or upper class or English or lower class or black or white, whatever it might be. You relate to them just as individuals who are also following the Buddha's Dharma. So the rivers converge when they reach the ocean. So they leave behind their sort of their identities when they reach the ocean. So the Buddha said that the great ocean remains the same. So his point here was nirvana remains the same. And he said that the oceans contain all sorts of precious gems. And by this he meant that the teachings are very, very precious. Sometimes when I sit up here at the teaching something, what I have to remember actually is that sometimes a lot of what I'm saying sounds, I've heard it a lot and I've said it a lot. It can sound a bit old hat, but I've never sort of been. I'm always surprised by how much the sort of teachings that sound old hat to me, really people can be really quite struck by them, that they can have an incredible effect, and because maybe people haven't heard them much before already. It might be the first time, the second time that they've ever heard those teachings, and suddenly it sort of strikes them. So the Dharma is full of these sort of incredible teachings, and of course it's not just that these teachings can be sort of grasped and then dropped. Actually, they've always got sort of layers and levels to them, and can be gone into further and further and further and further. Even the most basic of the Buddha's teachings can be gone into further and further and further, and keep on unfolding for you, so that it keeps on sort of bearing fruit. It keeps on sort of showing its kind of magnificence. And the Buddha also says that the ocean is the abode of great creatures. So the people that practice the Dharma are these sort of, particularly maybe over a long time, are very kind of mystical sort of, kind of wonderful sort of great creatures. That was the first thing that attracted me to the Dublin Buddhist Centre when I first came across it. I met who went on to be a KM, a spiritual mentor, Vajrashura, and it looks like he came out of a bog. He looks like he's from the west of Ireland. You could not get a more... Well, he is actually from the west of Ireland. Could not get a more sort of... We call them... In Dublin, they'd be called boggers, right? And they're people who grew up in a farm off the west of Ireland, in Connemara, something like that. Or in a village with 4 pubs, a church and a school, that sort of thing, basically. That's exactly what he looked like. This shock of red hair and freckles and pale skin. But he had just something that was just automatically sort of recognisable, that just fascinated me from the day I met him. And I just thought, what is it that this guy has got? And whatever he's got, I want some of that. It's just this sort of mysterious, and he still sort of surprises me. I'm still impressed by him. I still look up to him. A lot actually to this day, and hopefully you'll meet people in the Sangha, the community of the Buddha's followers, who particularly who have been practicing for a while. There's something about them. What is it that they've got? And it'll be sort of fascinating. That's one in Tibetan Buddhism said one of the rights of the guru, of the teacher, is the right of fascination. It's the capacity to just sort of fascinate you and make you think, well, what is it that they've got? Maybe if I too practice the Dharma, that I'll get that as well. So it's the abode of great creatures. So the Dharma it gets gradually deeper and deeper. It's stable in nature. It rejects a dead body. Its rivers converge when they reach the great ocean. The rivers converge when they reach the great ocean. It remains the same. The great ocean remains the same. It contains all sorts of precious gems, and is the abode of great creatures, the abode of sort of mysterious beings. So those are the 7 characteristics. But that's not the characteristic that Sangharakshita was talking about, Bhante Sangharakshita was talking about when he gave this particular talk. The characteristics that he was particularly concerned about, actually, was that the great ocean has one taste, just as the great ocean has one taste, the taste of salt, so too the Dharma has but one taste, the taste of freedom. So just as the great ocean has but one taste, the taste of salt, so too the Dharma has but one taste, the taste of freedom. So what did he mean by that? So this thing, vimukti, well, why don't I ask you actually? I'll sort of put it to you. What do you think the Buddha meant when he said that the great ocean has but one taste, the taste of freedom? Yeah.
No more suffering?
No more suffering? Yeah. Freedom from suffering in a sense, yeah.
Freedom from attachment.
Could you say a little bit more about that?
Well, that you can't identify or align yourself, like life is not out there.
Yeah.
With a thought, emotion or material. It's all within.
It's all internal. It's the internal that matters. Yeah. So freedom from the things that you're attached to as the things that you think will sort of give you satisfaction in that sort of sense. Yeah. Anybody else?
Freedom of the world?
Yes, actually.
Because you're out there by yourself, so you get to be in peace with yourself without being judged. I'll go into that. That's right. Yeah. So in a sense, it's freedom from.
I suppose maybe what you're saying is sort of expectations in a certain way. Yeah. That's a very good one, actually. I will actually come back to that maybe towards the end. But yes, so there's also an element of freedom in terms of the kind of assumptions and the expectations that others might sort of put on you. Yeah. One last one, maybe. Yeah, Brian.
In quite a lot of Buddhism, there's a kind of sense of letting go and relaxation. For example, if truthful speech often has that, after you've been completely truthful and honest about something,
yeah,
then there's kind of like a letting go of everything, and it's like a sense of freedom arises, and in that freedom all your positive qualities can arise too.
Yes, yeah.
And it's also that relaxation in meditation as well, like you let go, it's just complete letting go of everything, and it's kind of like you just side out.
Yeah,
isn't it?
yeah. So there's that sort of sense of like release.
Yeah.
It's that, it feels a bit like that. I remember when I first went on retreat, I got involved initially with the Dublin Buddhist Centre, and on my first sort of week retreat, it must have been about maybe 11 or 12 years ago now. It was in Cavan, and we were looking at this whole area of the self, and very, very significant Buddhist teaching, that this self that we sort of are attached to, this separated and distinct self, distinct from others and distinct from the world around us, that we're very, very attached to and that we protect and defend, is basically an illusion. According to the Buddha, that self, that sense that we exist in a fixed way and somehow sort of own our experience and are separated from others and from the world around us, is actually based on an illusion. It doesn't really, it's not really part of reality. It's not there in reality. That in reality what we are is a constantly arising and falling away of conditions and processes. That's what a human being is. So this thing that we sort of are very, very attached to, which is ourselves, nothing wrong with that, very, very normal, healthy human thing to be attached to ourselves. It causes us all sorts of problems, but that is our starting point, according to the Buddha. We're sort of stuck to it. And we talked a lot about that on this particular retreat. And towards the end of the retreat, I remember we were doing a bit of reflection on this whole sort of area, and we were particularly noticing impermanence, actually, in our experience. So we were looking at the constantly arising and falling away nature of our own experience. And what we were being encouraged to do was to look at our experience and see, was there anything within that experience that was stable, fixed and permanent? So could we find this sort of fixed thing that we called ourselves within our own experience? So we were doing that, and we were kind of walking up and down the grass. You know, you do like looking like zombies sometimes on retreat, where you kind of, if the postman sometimes comes in, they're like, what is going on here? And I remember just sort of stopping, and all of a sudden it started to rain. It just started to rain. I was under the tree and it started to rain. And out of nowhere, I've never had an experience like this again. It was completely non-repeatable. These experiences, you can't bid them. But out of somewhere, it was almost like this sort of window opened, and I got this very brief glimpse into the prospect of what realizing that sort of teaching would feel like. And the feeling was complete liberation. It was complete freedom. And now, interestingly enough, that was the word that I put it on it immediately, even though I don't think that had been mentioned in the week already, the idea that dropping this sense of tight, fixed self, dropping it would lead to liberation or freedom. But that was immediately the sense that I had of it. Now, it was a moment of vision. It wasn't me actually letting go of myself in any sort of way. That's a massive project in Buddhism. I wasn't enlightened all of a sudden. But what it was this window opening up, where I got this idea of the release and the relief, the liberation, the freedom that would come about by realizing what the Buddha realized when he became enlightened. It was just like you could just drop it all. You could just drop the whole project of me. Fantastic. Fantastic. The whole useless project of me. Yeah? Brilliant. And it was like, almost like you were carrying these rucksacks for like years and years and years, just massive heavy bags, and you just dropped them and you go, yes, that's so good. Yeah. And then of course it shut down. The experience shut down. And there's no point clinging to it. There's no point thinking, oh, how do I get that back? Well, you get that back through a lot of work, actually. Sometimes what's said of those visions is that it's a bit like sort of seeing the summit of a mountain. You suddenly see how sort of high it is, the grandeur of it, the incredibleness of it, but you're yet to climb it. You see it is sort of where you could get to, but then the hard work happens from there. You actually start to climb it at that point, if you choose. Actually, it's then up to you whether you want to climb it. Actually, lots of people decide from then on that they don't want to. It's very, very hard work. That's when the hard work starts. And lots of people decide, you know what, it's not for me. So that was my first experience of this retreat, and it was a sort of very, I think, tangible sort of sense as to, what it might have meant. I still refer back to that experience, actually, what it might mean to sort of gain that sort of freedom, or to gain that kind of liberation for oneself, and to help others to do it as well. But we needn't you don't need to, I don't think, have an experience of that kind to get a sense of what we're talking about. You certainly don't need to become enlightened to get a sense of what you're talking about. I hope that many of you here, if you've been practicing meditation and Buddhism for a while, that you'll started to get a small sense of that freedom already for yourselves, because it manifests in lots of different ways. We can say, for example, have much more sort of freedom over how we act, or much more sense of agency of how we act, the freedom to actually have a choice in a situation. So often we feel like, like our minds just sort of mechanically move down a particular sort of way. Cash Mitra gave this talk, Mind, Reactive and Creative, some weeks ago. If some of you would have been at that, you would have heard how so often our minds just mechanically go sort of from A to B to C to D, in often quite a negative way. It's like we've grooved this sort of habit of mind for ourselves, and we don't make conscious choices in terms of where our mind is going to go. We just we go boom, boom, boom. It's like a machine. There's no freedom there. There's no agency there. So you see a good-looking person, you lust after them for a day. Somebody says something that pushes your buttons. You get angry for a week. You're reminded of a meeting that you have with your boss, in 2 weeks' time. You get anxious for 48 hours. All of those things. There's no sense of choice. That's often where our mind, when we have a mechanical mind like that, not a creative mind, we don't have any agency over it. It goes bam, 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 bam. That's what it said, what it is to react. It's not, there's not a freedom there. There's a sort of inevitable kind of sort of flow of the mind down a particular channel. Whether that channel we want it to go down there, or if we don't want it to go down there. It just sort of flows down. And that's often how our mind is, isn't it? But I think you can get that sort of feeling as well. It's almost like being kind of undermined by your mind, don't you? Sometimes you can feel so sort of undermined by your own mind, like your own mind has sort of betrayed you. I remember that my last act on Facebook ever was to get into this huge, this was about 10 years ago, to get into this huge argument over Facebook, that I actually took a day off work to sort of formulate. I was working with Akash Mitra at the time. I didn't tell him that I took a day off work, but I sat there in the office, and of course it looked sort of worky enough. I think I did it on a Word doc or something like that, to formulate my sort of responses to this argument on Facebook. And I'm sat there going, this is pathetic. This is ridiculous. And I couldn't get myself out of it. I knew I was going to have to just follow it through. They were going to have to drop it because I couldn't. It was like I had no freedom in it. I had other things to do. My work didn't afford me to take days off to sort of formulate responses on Facebook. Luckily enough, I deleted Facebook after that. That was my last act on Facebook. I deleted it after that. But I felt so sort of unfree. Just completely without any agency. I couldn't stop it, even though I knew it was silly. I knew it was ridiculous. And you get this, say for example, a family member will say something to you, and you'll go, now this isn't the thing I'm going to make of it, and just watch yourself make it the thing that you didn't want to make of it. Where you just feel completely undermined by your own mind. So often we don't have sort of freedom. In that particular sense. So what you might have experienced now, hopefully many of you will have started to experience now in practicing Buddhism and practicing meditation, is that sometimes what will happen is you'll start to get a sense of agency within those situations that previously sort of shackled you to a particular outcome. It's like all of a sudden you'll have a choice, and it'll surprise you. That's been my experience of it, that all of a sudden it'll sort of surprise me. I'll be sort of going about a situation, and suddenly I'll find myself in a scenario that would usually provoke a reaction. And miracle of miracles, somehow it doesn't come up, it doesn't arise. And that the feeling is one of freedom. The feeling is actually suddenly having agency over my own mind. The ones that I used to particularly sort of, where I'd get into mechanical sort of reactive mind, was if I sort of thought my time was being wasted, that would really kind of wind me up. So if I saw a bad movie or something like that, and the other one was, coming to bad talks at the Buddhist Center. There's plenty of them. I've given them, And I used to sit there and sort of get so wound up by it. But I remember actually this one time when I was sat there, it was a shocking talk, start to finish. And somehow it just didn't arise. The reaction didn't arise. It was such a sense of freedom and release. So some of you might have had those experiences in your own life where it's like you step into a situation that would usually push your buttons. But there's suddenly, because you've been practicing ethics, you've been practicing meditation, maybe you've been studying the Dharma, you've been cultivating awareness of your mind, you've been looking to develop agency, a creative mind as opposed to a reactive mind. You don't go down the usual route that you go down, and you think, oh, what freedom, what relief. I don't have to behave in that way. There are alternatives. I can do something different. So that actually, when Buddhism talks about, sometimes you have this sort of discussion, don't you, in the West or generally of determinism versus free will. It's not actually sort of the dualism or the dichotomy that the Buddha would have talked about. He wouldn't have seen it in those terms. That sort of binary choice. Actually, what the Buddha said is that actually in Buddhism, what's usually said is that you can cultivate free will. That your mind can either be deterministic, it can be like a penny slot machine where you put in an input and out comes the output without any sense of freedom or choice, or with the cultivation of positive mental states, you can actually develop free will. So it's not so much determinism or free will, but actually cultivating more free will generally. So in that particular debate. So why taste, do you think? If somebody says that if the Dharma is said to have a single taste, the taste of freedom, just like the ocean has a single taste, the taste of salt, why taste? Why use the term taste?
I think taste, in terms of like our senses, is one that has kind of a lot of. It's hard to explain to someone. There's kind of like a lot of depth to it. You kind of you can keep sitting with some taste and keep delving a bit more into it, and exploring out. And often when you go back to like remember taste, there's kind of like a kind of, I don't know, you can kind of like explore it as well. It's kind of like that idea of savouring something, kind of like sitting with it. It's quite a kind of felt experience, which I think is kind of different from how we sense other things.
So there's a sort of gradation to it, isn't there? And there's sort of kind of levels and various things to it. Yeah.
Is it something more that you can't grasp freedom, you engage with it? You can't just cage it. You go, I'm free now. It's something that you work with.
How is that related to taste, would you say? What's the connecting thing there? Or?
Well, once taste is a very present thing.
Yes,
you can't recreate something.
Yes, that's it.
Reimagine it.
Yes, exactly, that's
Very
right.
present.
Yeah, that's right. It'd be hard to sort of reimagine a kind of, I don't know, the taste of chocolate or something. You could try, but it wouldn't be as immediate at all. Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah.
Well, taste implies food, and food implies sustenance. So it just makes me think that the Dharma is like a source of sustenance, the way food is.
Yeah. I've never actually thought about that, but I think that that's quite a good way of putting it as well. So that's a nice thing about metaphors, isn't it? They have various different ways that you can sort of come at them, but it is, I think, one of the significant things anyway. What Sangharakshita was saying in this talk is that taste it's a very immediate experience. It's sort of got, when you taste something kind of sharp or maybe strong, it's a very, very strong sense to it in a way that maybe sort of sight doesn't have the same sort of thing. It's very kind of immediate. I suppose it's to do with because you have to be very, very attuned to taste buds. Evolutionary taste would give you a sense as to something that was dangerous or good, or if you wanted more of it, or if you were to sort of not go anywhere near it, taste would sort of give you that sense. So maybe it's that. It's very kind of, in a sense, intimate, isn't it? Sort of the taste of something is very kind of immediate and tends to establish a strong sort of either movement towards or a movement away from. So the Dharma is said to have the taste of freedom in that particular, so that it's that tangible. That the freedom that the Dharma brings is that tangible. It's not like it's not just a sense of calm or a little bit more kind of like you loosen off your chains a little bit. It's a very, very tangible and sort of strong taste to it. Yeah. So what we're kind of thrown around by quite significantly in the world when we think of mechanical mind and mind that reacts automatically without agency, without freedom. Usually what does that to us is the worldly winds. Now, the Buddha talked about these 4 pairs of worldly winds. And these pairs of worldly winds are the sort of the winds that throw us about, the winds that we respond mechanically to. We move very, very strongly towards one of them and away towards the others, away from the other. So the Buddha said that these 4 pairs were gain and loss, pleasure and pain, fame and infamy, praise and blame. So gain and loss, pleasure and pain, fame and infamy, praise and blame. And of course, we're always looking to get one, and we're always looking to usually, not quite that straightforward actually, but we're usually looking to move away from the other. That's the way we go, and our mind tends to sort of do so automatically with often very, very little consideration for the consequences, and that's often where we get ourselves into trouble. We get sort of slaved. In fact, you could say we're sort of enslaved by them quite often. We just sort of move towards them in quite a sort of enslaved way. An aspect of this actually I think is sort of likes and dislikes. What we like and what we dislike. We're always moving in the direction of what we like and away from what we dislike. So we have a sort of craving for some things and an aversion for others. It's a different way of putting it. That we're sort of always moving towards what we want. We're pulling certain aspects of the world towards us and pushing other aspects of the world that we don't like, that we feel threatening, away from us. So we're always moving from one to the other. And I think actually what this does, this mechanical moving from one to the other, keeps us very limited and small as people. One of the things that Sangharakshita talked about when somebody asked him about, look, well, what is it we can do to start, very practically, to start overcoming this sense of a fixed, separate self, tight, defended separate self? Well, he said, well, try to move beyond preferences. Just try to move beyond preferences. Oftentimes our sense of ourselves is just lots and lots and lots of tiny little preferences. And often they keep us quite sort of limited as people. It's like, I like this, I don't like this. I like coffee, I don't like tea. I like orange juice, not apple juice. Suddenly we're sort of squeezed into these very, very specific shape. And oftentimes, actually, it's just an idea that we sort of layer over our experience. I'll tell a very brief story. Actually, recently I had a friend, I went to the Francis Bacon exhibition. This was like 6 months or a year ago, I think about a year ago. Now, anybody that knows Francis Bacon will know that he's very, very dark, extremely dark painting. And I don't think I knew of him when I came in. And my friend told me, oh, look, it is quite dark, you know. I was like, oh, okay, well, how dark? It's really dark, right? So you walk into it, and the first painting I go and I see it, like, oh, God. And it's, you know, I've got an hour and a half of this all the way around. It's like, oh, this is really dark. And of course, my first temptation is to go, this is rubbish. You know, to very directly label it. This is rubbish. But I actually had somebody talking to me about maybe loosening up my sense of likes and dislikes only like a couple of nights beforehand. Very, very strong preferences. I tend to get into this very strong sense of preference. I like this, I don't like that. It can be quite a strong view with me. What the problem is that prejudges, that prejudices the experience before you ever have it and moves it. Your narrative becomes your experience. So if you say that you don't like something, guess what? That's going to be your experience. So I just try to sort of relax that sort of labeling of the whole thing as bad or rubbish or whatever it might be. And what I noticed is actually as I just sort of stayed with it, 5, 10, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, it started to change. That actually I started to get drawn into the art. That eventually actually I started to find it quite thrilling. I actually started to find it quite sort of exhilarating in all its kind of macabre kind of dark kind of, darkness. I actually just found it really quite thrilling. And by the time I'd gone around the exhibition an hour and a half later, I was completely elated. But it was only because I'd been able to put down that sense of preference, that mechanical mind of going, oh, this is what this is, and this is the experience that I'll have, and actually relate to it with a bit more sense of freedom. And maybe coming out of it with a slightly different idea of who I was and what I liked or what I could enjoy and what I thought was good in the world and all of those sorts of things. So our preferences will often keep us very sort of enslaved to and limited to and boundaried to a very particular tight way of being, a very small way of being, and the ability to just sort of give them up to sort of try and get beyond them a little bit can be very, very good in creating this sense of freedom. Some people are so, I recognize this in myself as well. Some people I can be so tied to preference. How about we do this? Oh, I don't particularly like that. I prefer this. Okay, well, we could do this, but only yes, but if we can do that first. And lunch has to be this, and it has to have coffee of this particular type. And then, before you know it, where's the freedom there? You need a very, very specific series of sort of experiences to actually enjoy them. There's no sort of freedom. So can we go beyond preference? And that's particularly going beyond those likes and dislikes of the 8 worldly winds and moving from one to the other, having more sense of creativity, more sense of agency in the world, where we can just sort of, I suppose, move into something new and allow ourselves to be something new, allowing ourselves to have more sense of sort of spaciousness or freedom in our own lives. That, I think, is this sort of tangible sort of experience of moving into this realm of freedom. It's a more spacious attitude. There's much more kind of space in it. Everything's not so sort of enclosed and tight. Okay, so I was going to talk a little bit about the group, but I'm afraid I don't have time. So what we'll do is we'll leave it at that. But before we do, we'll just sort of settle for a few minutes of meditation again, and then just to sort of absorb that a little bit. So again, just coming back to the body. And coming back to an awareness of the breath. Maybe even we can get a sense of spaciousness.